Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Swedish webinar. As it is Swedish, it's organized by the Embassy of Sweden in Ukraine. As it is a webinar, then we're all online. My name is Andrei Kulikov, and I will be moderating this webinar, which is called The Role of a Public Broadcaster in a Time of Crisis. As is known, the public broadcaster has an essential role in providing independent news content to the public. In a time of crisis, and we are going through several crises now, unbiased information becomes even more important. In Ukraine, the public broadcaster provides an alternative to oligarch-owned media outlets. Previous budget proposal made by the Ukrainian government included cuts that threatened to destroy the public broadcaster. Despite the fact that the proposed budget cuts were withdrawn, the issue still remains. How can we ensure a strong public broadcaster in a time of crisis? What its role is? And if we are speaking about the role, then we are going to speak about characters. Two basic types of characters are defined: their qualities, functions, and importance for the development of the society. Flat characters and round characters. Flat characters are two-dimensional. They are relatively uncomplicated, and by virtue of this, they are easily understandable by the public. Also, there are dynamic characters that are those that change over the course of the story, and static characters remain the same throughout, which also makes for the public easier to get used to them. So when our panel discussion members, and we have a distinguished panel today, will be speaking, I will ask them to mention what they think. The public broadcaster is a flat character or a round character, a dynamic character or a static character. We are quite pressed on time, so without much further ado, I give the floor for welcoming remarks to Tobias Turberg, Ambassador of Sweden in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Andrei. Can you hear me? Is it working?
Yes,
Good.
and not only me, but the entire Facebook audience.
Good. Andrei, you mentioned how extremely important media, functioning free media landscape, and a trustworthy public broadcaster are in times of crisis. Back in the day of the horrible nuclear disaster in Chernobyl, which struck Ukraine with tremendous force, Swedish citizens, Swedish media consumers knew about what was going on in Ukraine before Ukraine's own citizens did. I think nothing could be a more painful and a more apt reminder of how absolutely crucial free, independent media and a strong public broadcaster are in times of crisis. Now, I think it's also important to say at this stage what huge progress Ukraine has made since those dark days of the nuclear disaster in Chernobyl. In 2017, Ukraine established Suspilne, its public broadcaster, which has done a tremendous job since then. And I think the current crisis demonstrates how important Suspilne has become in the media landscape in Ukraine. The Ukrainian public broadcaster has really been working in overdrive, providing unbiased, trustworthy information to Ukrainian media consumers, and in spite of their very limited budget and very limited resources, they have really stepped up to the current challenge, increasing their viewership and the trust that society shows in them, in the public broadcaster. Sweden is a very proud partner of the public broadcaster of Ukraine. We've been working with them for a long time. and we will continue and expand our support to Suspilne this year, among other things in view of the forthcoming local elections in the fall of 2020. Sweden is also a country which places a lot of emphasis on the importance of media freedom. We have the world's oldest Freedom of Information Act, more than 250 years old, and it is one of the things I think that every Swede has reason to be justifiably proud and grateful for. Looking at some of the challenges facing the media landscape today, I would just like to name two of those. One of them is the issue of funding, and Andrei was mentioning that briefly today. There still are challenges that remain before Suspilne can have a truly predictable and sufficient funding model to make sure that it can fill its function in the Ukrainian media landscape. And I would hereby also very much like to urge the Ukrainian leadership to engage actively with the help of the Council of Europe in making sure that we reach a point where there is a proper, functioning, reliable and sufficient funding model for the public broadcaster in Ukraine. The second issue I wanted to raise briefly in these words of introduction are the issue of safety of journalists and media workers, where unfortunately we still have serious problems in Ukraine. We've been seeing only recently mounting pressure on investigative journalists in Ukraine. And in a time of crisis like this, no time could be more apt to be very clear about the unacceptability of pressure, threats and violence against journalists and media workers. This should be an absolute priority for the Ukrainian authorities in the Swedish view. Finally, I would just very much like to thank the Council of Europe, which has been a long-standing partner of Sweden in the area of media freedom in the work that we do together. They're also co-organizers of today's webinar, and I'd like to thank them so much for their steadfast support to Ukraine in partnership with Sweden when it comes to establishing a truly free media landscape in Ukraine. And with those words, I would just like to say how much I look forward to following this exciting webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And of course, even such an experienced society and proud country as Sweden could not cope on its own in organizing such a seminar, webinar. So it is organized together with a project. European Union and Council of Europe work together to support the freedom of media in Ukraine. And of course, we have a representative from the Council of Europe here. He is Patrick Pennings, Head of Information Society Department of the Council of Europe. So, Mr. Pennings, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrei. I wouldn't say that Sweden is not able to organize such a webinar on its own, but I think it's all in its advantage to be able to organize this webinar together with the Council of Europe. I think in times of crisis, it's even more important to be able to have joint efforts rather than efforts of one single country. Now, budget cuts, frozen bank accounts, underfinancing, understaffing of public service media, these are issues which are of course exacerbated by the current COVID crisis. Dear Ambassador, dear Tobias, dear parliamentarians and panelists, the current COVID crisis has put freedom of expression under further threat, as we have already witnessed within the Council of Europe. The platform for the protection of journalists is increasingly questioned, is increasingly alerted of ongoing issues. The use of Article 15 of the European Convention on Human Rights, where 10 countries have requested exceptional measures to the European Convention under the crisis. Our Secretary General Maria Pejcinovic-Buric reminded our member states of the fundamental values. And when she wrote to the prime minister of one of our member states, she did receive a rather negative reply. And even the Nordic countries which supported her did receive a little bit of a lashback there. So that is an important issue because it basically means what in times of crisis are our governments increasingly tempted maybe to do away with our fundamental values, and that is something that we will have to address. Thank you for the Parliamentary Committee and the Swedish authorities for organizing this together. Also, I think it is important that the Parliamentary Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy, for the attention of the public broadcasting that they have given on the reform and its effectiveness, building constructive dialogue with the media community and international organizations, and trusting the Council of Europe as well to prepare a legal opinion on the proposed amendments on the law on public television and radio broadcasting of Ukraine, of which you will be hearing during this panel as well. From the very beginning, the Council of Europe has been actively supporting public broadcasting reforms in Ukraine. It started with the adoption of the new law on public service broadcasting in 2015, which was based on the recommendations provided by the Council of Europe. By the way, Yves Solomon who is with us today, prepared that Council of Europe legal opinion on the legislation. Since then, our cooperation projects in Ukraine have been providing throughout legal and practical support to the newly established public broadcaster in building its structure, training and optimizing of staff, reorganization and developing models of regional public broadcasting. Also to increase the capacity to produce professional and trustworthy content. And this, ladies and gentlemen, in times of crisis is what is needed. So I would say that freedom of expression, obviously, and access to news are crucial for the functioning of a truly democratic society. That has already been mentioned by the Swedish ambassador. And that has of particular importance in the light of any crisis that we may face, especially the COVID-19 pandemic. There is an intensified need for people to be able to consume news they can trust, such that they help them understand the current crisis in order to protect themselves and their communities, and that enables them as well to critically assess their government's responses to the health crisis. Media in times of crisis play an essential role and have a particular responsibility to provide accurate, reliable, prompt information to the public, abiding by the highest professional standards and ethics. However, as journalists strive to adapt their activities to the health crisis, new challenges are amplifying the pre-existing weaknesses of the media sector and reinforce the concerns that I mentioned. Reporting on the pandemic is no easy task amidst criticisms and restrictions of access to information and public events due to lockdown. In this situation, journalists often pick up exaggerated narratives or may uncritically relay false information about the crisis. Therefore,
Patrick,
professional,
you know that
independent and strong public broadcaster is essential to us. So I would like to thank you for giving me the floor in the opening of this seminar, and I'm counting on listening to our panelists to this debate. Thank you so much.
Patrick, from some not very reliable sources, I know that you have a presentation, or am I mistaken? No, obviously I'm mistaken. Anyway, this adds pepper to our conversation. And now the time has come to introduce the panelists. And these are today Jan Pettersson, Director of Strategy, Swedish Radio. also Yevhen Hlibovitsky, board member of Public Broadcasting Company UK, member of Nestor Group. Yes. Make some sign, Mr. Hlibovitsky, so that everybody sees that. Yes, yes, yes. Yevgenia Kravchuk, member of Parliament of Ukraine and deputy chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policy. And Yves Salomon, who is the international legal expert from the Council of Europe and who is credited with much of good things that were done to establish public broadcaster in Ukraine. Dear participants, we will later have questions from the audience, and those who watch us on YouTube may already file their questions. But before we turn to the Q&A session, every one of you will have some time to explore and explain their views according to our schedule. We consulted with you previously. So, I will tell everyone who has how much time, and 1 minute before the scheduled time is up, I will make some noises telling you to round up. All right? And also, please remember that it's very important to know whether public broadcaster is flat or round, whether it's dynamic or static. And with this reminder, I give the floor to Jan Petter.
So, hope you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I have a presentation, so maybe you could put it up.
Hello?
Yes, I have a presentation, I think they... Hello, can you hear me? Yes, you hear me, yes, yeah. But there should be a presentation, so I think there it is. Okay, thank you very much. Every day in Sweden we have a press conference at 2 o'clock where the health authorities talk about the situation. And I think that lots and lots of people, of course, following this, and it's very important that we really broadcast it and so on. And I think also that we have an audience boom in this crisis. But I would like to emphasize that the role of the public service broadcaster in all media, the role is the same in crisis as in, let's say, normal situation. So if you take next slide, please. There are 4 very important words that I think pave the ground for all media, and especially perhaps public service broadcasting. That is trust, relevance. You should be impartial and independent. If you look at the Swedish context, you see that the public service broadcasters, we have actually 3 of them. One TV company, one radio company, one educational company, and all of them have a very high score when you measure the trust. They are the most trusted companies, media companies in Sweden. And it takes time to do this. It's not something that you do in the afternoon. We have been working with this for years and years. 50, 60 years to develop a system that works quite well. And we try to develop it, and we see that we meet some problems on the way that we have to have a look at. So if you look at take the next picture. The next slide, please. Yes. So if you talk about the independence report, talk about regulation, there are of course the formal rules, the formal regulation. And sometimes you can have a feeling of this is a kind of ceremonial speeches when you talk about everything about independence and this beautiful wording. And then there are lots of soft factors. That means there are informal norms and situation in society and so on. And these 2 parts have to balance together to really get a system that works. And that means, if you take the next slide, please, that there must be some kind of consensus in society. I don't mean that everybody should think the same. I think that everybody should see the role of journalists and see the role of public service broadcasting, and really protect the formal and the fundamental values of public service broadcasting. The regulation as such does not secure public service. It's how it works in practice that is important, of course. And you can do more to really protect public service. And today, if you look at the Swedish regulation, for instance, if you look at the next slide, please, you can see this is a regulation made for beautiful weather. And if you come into another situation where we get a little bit stormy weather, if you take the next slide, please. So if you take the next slide, we go into stormy weather. Will this regulation hold? You don't know really, and you have to see if this stress test is showing how public service really can work in a situation that we have today. And we have started an investigation in Sweden now. If you look at the next slide, we have started a constitutional investigation to see if we can find a way to really protect public service even one step further. That means that for a change in public service broadcasting regulation, the basic regulation, there should be a decision made, one decision made before an election and the same decision made after an election, to make it a little bit more complicated to do big changes in the work of public service and the regulation of public service broadcasting. So what it's all about is this red line. If you take the next slide. There is a red line, and that is the basic of public service and also of all media. And if you take next slide, I can explain. On one side you have the state, and on the other side you have the public service broadcaster, and there should be a broad as possible line between these two entities. And if you look at the Swedish context, you can have it on next slide, please. You see that on one side we have the parliament, the government, the broadcasting commission. On the other side we have the public service broadcasting system. So it works like this, that we have a state investigation, we have public hearings and proposals and so on. There will be decisions in the parliament, and based on the decision, the public service companies will get their remit. And also very interesting, if you compare to what's happening in Ukraine, we have one decision for the regulation, the remit, for 6 years. We also have a decision for financing for 6 years. We also have a decision for financing that means that we get 2% increase every year. And this decision made for long term is of course very good for stability of public service. So the idea is that on the political side, so to speak, they should be putting up the framework, and the public service broadcaster should be the ones that runs it. So there is an ownership trust between the politicians and the system. And that means that this ownership trust has two missions. One is to keep the politicians away, arm's length distance. The other mission is to appoint the members of the board in the three public service broadcasting companies. And this makes it a little bit more secure when you talk about political interference to try to build up a system like this. So, if you take next slide. What is necessary to really be running a public service broadcasting organization? This is, well, in the best of cases, so to speak. There should be remit, a mission, with very clear rules and a long-term decision. And it should be framework, it should be no details. According to organization, there should be an ownership that promotes service, and there is a kind of buffer between politicians and the company. And there should be no political interference in appointing members of the board and the management. Financing, it's very important that you try to find a system, if it's not outside the state budget, if it's inside the state budget, it should be long term, so you really know how much money you have for your business. And this should be, as I said, several years. We also have a system with the Broadcasting Commission that really evaluates what's going on in the companies and evaluating the result and so on. And that's also a very important component. And I think these are good prerequisites to handle public service broadcasting if it's a crisis or even if it's not a crisis. So I think that if you invest in a system like this, if you take the last slide here, please, you see that this is an investment in public service media, is an investment in democracy. So thank you very much.
I remind you that she is a legal expert at the European Commission. Hello? Hello? While technical glitches, they will not... Yes, here she is. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to run through the recommendations that I've made, having looked at the draft law, making amendments to the current law on public service broadcasting. I'm just going to pick out the matters of concern, which mostly threaten the potential independence of the public service broadcaster. So I have a presentation again, if you could load that, please. And I'm happy to take questions about this later on in the webinar. So I'm just going to lay out the basics right now. The next slide, please. So the main conclusions of the analysis, one by one. The law on joint stock companies should not be applied to the Ukraine public service broadcaster. According to the law on joint stock companies, a joint stock company is a business entity with a charter capital divided into a specific quantity of shares of stock of equal nominal value, and the corporate rights to which are certified by shares of stock. Well, the Ukrainian public service broadcaster is not a business entity in that it's a not-for-profit enterprise. It has no charter capital or saleable stock, and it cannot issue dividends. So I do not think that the law on joint stock companies should be applied to something which is a different creature altogether. Furthermore, the law on joint stock companies gives the shareholder a large number of competencies, which, in the case of the public service broadcaster, go to its very independence. Now, in the case of Ukraine, the shareholder is actually the State Committee on TV and Radio, which is a state organism which, in previous analyses that I've done for the Council of Europe, I have strongly recommended be abolished. So the fact that the state entity has all these powers, which could be invoked, completely undermines the true independence of the public service broadcasting company. And that is in direct breach of Council of Europe standards. Secondly, the supervisory board should not be able to interfere with executive actions. There are a number of proposed amendments to the law which seek to give the supervisory board a role in matters which should remain the sole prerogative of the executive staff. And these amendments should be removed. Third, the law should not stipulate the amount of funding or percentage of budget to be applied to independent programming. Now, some proposed amendments seek to require the public service broadcaster to apply at least half of its budget to the costs of certain types of programming. And it goes on to require that at least half of that money, that is a quarter of the total budget, should go to independent productions. That is an interference with editorial independence, again in breach of Council of Europe standards. Fourthly, there should be no additional financial pressure applied to the public service broadcaster. As other speakers have already commented, Ukraine's public service broadcaster is woefully underfunded as it is. The amendments to the law provide further obligations to provide online information, which is absolutely right. The broadcaster should be doing that. And it allows for members of the supervisory board to be remunerated, which again is acceptable. But neither should happen without increased funding for the public service broadcaster. It struggles enough as it is. It can't take on more responsibility without more money. Next slide, please. There are a few additional points. They're all set out in much more detail in my analysis, so I'll just read through them in English for those who don't read Ukrainian. The main activities of the public service broadcaster should all be set out in the law and not subject to change by the supervisory board. The power to terminate the role of the chairman, vice chairman, and secretary should be set out in the law and not be given to the supervisory board, because again, that allows for potential political interference. And the supervisory board should not monitor the implementation of the editorial statute and charter, as that would give it regulatory powers. And those regulatory powers actually belong with the National Commission. Next slide. The supervisory board should have no involvement in day-to-day transactions or be involved in individual contractual arrangements. These are all executive matters. The government is going to provide that key performance indicators set by the Cabinet of Ministers be applied to the public service broadcaster. It's very, very important to ensure that these KPIs are specific to public service broadcasting and not generic indicators, because that wouldn't work and it would be a huge imposition and again an interference with independence. The supervisory board should have the power to create its own audit committee if it wishes to do so. It's pleasing that the requirement to have an audit committee is being removed, but nonetheless there should be permission for an audit committee to be introduced if that's what the supervisory board wishes. And finally, there is a suggestion that there is an internal audit function within the internal arrangements organization of the public service broadcaster. I strongly recommend that that is not done, and instead an external firm is contracted to undertake internal audit as and when required. So those are my main concerns with the draft law, and look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Solomon. I remind that Eve Solomon is an international legal expert of the Council of Europe, and the next person to speak will be the member of the Ukrainian Parliament, Evgenia Kravchuk. She is a co-author of the draft law on public broadcasting, on the operation on public television and radio broadcasting of Ukraine. And she will speak in Ukrainian, but after she finishes her speech, I'll recuperate on it briefly for the sake of our English-speaking participants. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I would like to greet all the members of the discussion before I go to Ukrainian about the legislation. I guess it's not, yes, not my title, but nevertheless. Thank you for this discussion. Actually, maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not, but we had a group meeting with supervisory board and the members of the board and the chairman of the board of Suspilne, of public broadcaster, with my colleagues from the committee. We actually discussed a bit about where is the broadcaster now and their plans. Отже, перейду на українську, тому що там буде
To
багато.
Ukrainian, because there will be many legal issues there. Basically, we will consider in the nearest future, and our committee recommends to consider before the first reading the draft law on public broadcaster. Maybe this will happen next plenary week. Maybe the colleagues didn't know, but we had some limited format of work in the Verkhovna Rada, and next week will be the first plenary week, full-fledged plenary week, after there were some restrictions related to COVID-19. So we most probably will consider this draft law in the first reading. Thank you for the opinion. I would request the representatives of the Council of Europe to send us this opinion in the written form so that we can discuss it with our working group, so that we can take it into account when preparing the second reading and maybe introduce some amendments. Basically, why do we need this draft law? I now will not talk in detail about the collision as to the law, how it's correlated with the law on shareholding societies. But when we made our legal analysis of the public broadcaster, we understand that they have some specific features which are to be taken into account, but we believe that the law on shareholding societies could be applied to it, but we are ready to take into account the opinion of the colleagues from the Council of Europe and discuss it. As to strengthening of the strategic functions of the supervisory board, we had two aims: to strengthen institutional capacity and also to speed up the efficiency of decision making, and so that there's no conflict between different conflicts of managerial structure. We were trying to write the functions of the supervisory board so that it corresponds to the international standards of the corporate management, to the OSCE standards, and so that it doesn't contradict the powers of the shareholder and the board. That concerns, and the management, that concerns impossibility to interfere into the economic activity and other things. A big problem for broadcaster, and I believe Evgen will talk about that more, is there is no legislative possibility to buy content from independent companies that produce. We have a discussion in the committee on this level of financing for procurements from independent producers. Not less than half budgetary funds are directed to pay for creation of films, some TV or radio programs by independent from PBC studios. and we were trying to write that not more than half of the budgetary funds. We will continue our work between the readings, and we will discuss this item more, and we will define the limit. A lot was mentioned about funding. In legislation, it's 0.2% from the state budget for funding the public broadcaster. This year the budget was cut off, but I would like to underscore that the Committee on Information and Humanitarian Policy had a very active position when the budget was reviewed. We did it because now there's no head of the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy, there's just an acting head, and we were even more active supporting the budget, and most part of it we managed to preserve, and the broadcaster will have a chance, maybe not ideally, but to preserve the functionality at a proper level, because this cutting off concerned many sectors, like the culture. Some programs were cancelled, and our position as to funding of the public broadcaster was very strong, and we hope that in 2021 the funding will be higher, and it will be possible to add some new programs. One item as to draft law allows to broaden the technological structure, giving the right to the public broadcaster to spend money for disseminating information online, to develop the digital platform. And we will continue to communicate with the public broadcaster, with the supervisory board, and we would like to see the presentation on the development of the digital platform. We believe that this is a very important direction, and it could be quite effective for disseminating information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This leaves more time for panel discussion and questions and answers. We heard that the supervisory board is extremely important in the work of the public broadcaster, and there are still discussions how to make its role even more important and how give more authority to the supervisory board. So now I give the floor to Mr. Yevgen Glibovitsky, who is board member of the Public Broadcasting Company Ukraine, UA, and member of the Nestor Group.
I'm glad to be able to participate in this meeting. I think what we are discussing right now is essential not only for the short term, but actually for the long-term well-being of both the public service broadcast, but also freedom of speech and the development of democracy in Ukraine. I think these amendments that are right now in the parliament are crucial for the pace at which public service broadcast will be developing. And I think it's incredibly important to be inclusive, as inclusive as possible at this point, to both advise criticism, but also to hear arguments from all sides. What we are talking about, as we have learned over the last 4 years, is not about some kind of ideal model that can be theoretically developed and then implemented in Ukraine. What we are doing right now at this point is trying to fine-tune a concept of public service broadcast that has been developed in very different set of conditions, both technological and societal, in the open or in the free world about 70 years ago, and adjusted to the country that is in the midst of transition from the totalitarian set of institutions to the set of institutions that define this free world. As a result, we have a number of issues that are arising that are not typical for many supervisory boards or many governance models that we see in European countries, for instance. Some are for the better. For instance, the model of creation of the supervisory board from the civil society and the representatives of the parliamentary fractions is probably one of the most advanced models that we can speak of in public service broadcast of modern era. But at the same time, we have learned about the shortcomings. One of the issues is the level of qualification of the members of both supervisory boards or any actually managerial positions. What we have learned is that there is a lot of experience on the market, but that experience relates to either toxic models or to the models that are no longer in existence. For a lot of people who participate in management of the public service broadcast, both members of the supervisory board or members of the managerial board or managers of other ranks, it's a very new experience. It's a very new experience. It's a very new role, and this is something that they have to gain experience in. This is something that they have to learn to do. I would like to point out some of the positive changes for the in this draft, and one of them is actually creation of provision that would allow to compensate the supervisory board members for the work. Not because I'm a member of the supervisory board member, but actually because I'm worried that if we do not compensate that work, and we already see how much of the work it is, it's actually, for those who are in good faith attributing enough time to this, it takes anywhere between a quarter and probably 1/3 of their work time. If we do not compensate that time, what we will end up with is that the people from the civil society who are capable of being good members of the supervisory board will choose not to go and not to work as volunteers for 4 years in the next term of the supervisory board, and the elections are due later this year. The beginning of the process and selection is due later this year, and the risk is that we will end up either with only political representatives or political representatives and also politically engaged lieutenants who will be on the payroll officially or unofficially of the oligarchs or business groups who will not be representing the interest of the public, and especially long-term interest of the public in the supervisory board. It's also extremely important that people who get in are in good understanding of what they have to do. There was a lot of confusion inside at least the supervisory board that I can speak of as to what exactly should be the approach towards many issues that no one has done before. And in that sense, I think it's, of course, difficult to be the pioneer, but also it's important that we understand that there is a risk that we will have also pioneers in a second and a third term. And if we're looking into the sustainability of the public service broadcast, we have to understand that there should be certain adjustment between what we would like to see in the ideal supervisory board or governance model or financial model of the public service broadcast and what is feasible. If there is too little authority inside the managerial board, then the managerial board will not be able to make swift decisions inside the public service broadcast. And there are a lot of swift decisions that have to be taken with regard to many issues, including continuation of restructuring, including changes vis-a-vis the need to adapt. And if the law is a limiting factor, like it is right now, for instance, public service broadcast cannot use the budget funds for developing of its digital platform, which is absolutely outrageous. But at the same time, if we are in a situation where the governance is not inclusive, and that means that the managerial board should be strong, but also we need the strong supervisory board. If the supervisory board is not strong, then there will be the risk that the government or the politicians will try to put their hands in directly. And this is exactly what we want to avoid. We want the political bodies to send in these people that they trust to delegate the role, and not to interfere in any operational way. And thus, in order to make sure that this is possible, it's important that the supervisory board is as potent as possible. It's also important that we keep all the checks and balances in place, and these checks and balances in many situations will be also context specific. That means that we have to understand that, for instance, if we are talking about audit, it's important that we're not only talking about financial audit, but we're also talking about, for instance, organizational audit. There are some things that became more difficult because the previous law has decided that we are not starting the public service broadcast from scratch, but we are actually redoing the state TV and state radio into a completely new body. Well, one of the things that we know from corporate management is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that's exactly what most of the resources and most of the managerial energy went into, is fighting with the culture of old Soviet type of approach towards governance, towards management. And as a result, a lot of energy that could have been used much more productively was simply burned, because we basically had to deal not only with the institutional remnants, but also with the cultural remnants. And I think this fight is not over. And in that sense, it's also important that the whole system is flexible. The provisions that address the issue of working with other studios are useful because they allow the public service broadcast to understand whether it is capable, for whatever reasons, organizational limitations there might be, or any other, lack, in some cases, lack of talent of specific field. For instance, if you want, for instance, to do a scientific show and you don't have, you don't employ people who have specific knowledge, then you have to outsource that knowledge. and provisions that allow outsourcing more easily actually would allow public service broadcast to become more efficient. But at the same time, if the same provisions fixate the particular percentage of product that has to be purchased from the market, then it is clear that instead of uniting with the stakeholders via joint understanding of the mission, we are trying to purchase their loyalty. And in that sense, this attempt to change the law, I think in generally is a huge step forward, because it allows us to review what hasn't been working and what has to be improved. But at the same time, I think we should proceed cautiously, because it's very easy to actually make things worse by taking the opposite direction of change than we need. And in that sense, I think it's important that when the discussion continues, it's a very inclusive discussion that involves both the members of parliament, international stakeholders, Ukrainian expertise, members of the managerial and supervisory boards of the public service broadcast. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hlibovitsky, and we are 4 minutes or even 7 minutes ahead of schedule, which will provide you and other participants with more opportunity to dwell upon your focal points. Now we will go straight into the panel discussion. There are lots of questions already from the audience, but before we go to them, I will ask every one of you to react to what you heard from other participants. Partially this was already done. Ms. Kravchuk, for instance, reacted to recommendations of the legal experts, but still, do you feel that you want to emphasize in a positive or probably with a shade of doubt anything that you heard from other participants? Ms. Solomon.
Thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to hear that there's an openness to review some of the amendments in the law, and very happy to take that further and help you understand my recommendations if any of them seem unclear. I would say about a specific issue around the remuneration, the payment of members of the supervisory board. I think this could well be a good idea. Many other countries also pay their supervisory board members, but I have some very important caveats. One is the budget does need to be increased, actually above the 0.2%. to pay for that. And secondly, there is an additional danger that if members of the supervisory board are paid, they will feel even more of an obligation to take on executive functions. And I think that's already a problem that the draft law has. It seems to my mind, confuse sometimes supervisory responsibilities and management responsibilities. And it was said that the role of the supervisory board was sort of modeled on the corporate management standards of the OSCE. Well, the supervisory board is not about corporate management. It's about supervising what the corporate management does. So it's one step above that. And I remember when the new supervisory board took up its role, there was a lot of confusion. I mean, you're right, there was a lot of confusion about what is the supervisory board meant to do and what is it not meant to do. And I think in Ukrainian terms, this is a new creature. You don't have many examples of this in Ukraine. And it's really a board that takes the the high-level strategic view that monitors the performance of the executive management, but doesn't do any of the executive management. And I'll just make one other comment about the budget. From an international standard, the fact that the law actually requires 0.2% of the state budget to be paid to finance the public service broadcaster, and then the government decides to do something different, and that figure is not met. Not only does that damage the public service broadcaster, but it damages the reputation of Ukraine internationally, because this is a matter of the rule of law. And if the law is not followed for the public service broadcaster, then anybody who is wishing to contract with Ukraine or international organizations that want to negotiate and interact with Ukraine is going to wonder, well, what's the strength of it being in law if the law can just be disregarded on a whim? So it's so important that the law is followed and that there is no opportunity for decisions to be made that don't give the public service broadcaster what the law requires the state to give.
Thank you, Ms. Solomon. From some of the movements that Mr. Hlibovitsky made at the start of your speech, it was clear how he accepts and perceives your ideas, but what does a Ukrainian MP think about this? Ms. Kravchuk.
Well, actually, I covered a bit about the financing and how we fought for the budget during the cut of the budget. We, as members of parliament, of course, think that public broadcasters should have the full finance, but there is also a reality. And the reality about the Ukrainian budget in crisis year, because we're not only in COVID situation, but probably we will be experiencing economic problems. We have to understand that even this money that we saved for public broadcaster, it was very hard, to fight for. With Ministry of Finance that has to finance also, a lot of social things. And well, it's a pity we have a lot of laws actually that are about social finance, about categories of people who are poor and they need support, and not all of them also kept, and it's a big problem about what we earn and what we have to spend. But of course, we as a committee, as members of parliament, and we will do what we can to save the finance of the public broadcaster. And we'll have another fight for the finance for the next year, which will start in September, when we'll be forming the new budget. And we will probably by that time, understand in economic situation we'll have in Ukraine, and what money we'll have in the budget.
Thank you very much. Mr. Peterson, what's your reaction to what you have heard from other participants?
Well, I think that the idea of a supervisory board is a little bit blurry. It's a little bit mishmash, I think. It's difficult to really understand the role of the supervisory board. It's like a kind of overcoat of the management board of the public service broadcaster. And you get the feeling that maybe you don't trust the public service broadcaster to be able to run the business as they should. There must be some kind of overcoat controlling this, and this is could be quite complicated, and political interference is probably the basic problem. So if you could give the public service broadcaster a remit to give the public broadcaster a mission, what to do for the coming years, and to give them a budget, and then they have to run the business, and then you follow up in various ways. But it will give them more possibility to act. And when you're talking about commissioning, that you should work with independent companies, almost all public service broadcasters use commissioning. It's nothing strange that you use other companies, independent producers, to work with you for programming and so on. So that could work quite well. So I think that it's difficult to handle this supervisory board issue. The question is if it's really needed, or you could find another system, since you have quite a lot of problem to really define what it should do.
Thank you. Mr. Lebovitzky, in giving your reaction, maybe you could quote a example of how the supervisory board did some important things for the public broadcaster.
Forming the management for the public service broadcast would be one thing, and that's exactly what the supervisory board has to do. I think we have some kind of terms misunderstanding here, because I could not interpret the positions against the supervisory board in other way. If we don't have the supervisory board, that is between the political sector and the public service broadcast, then what we're going to get is a direct political control over the asset that physically belongs to the state. And this is unacceptable from the point of view of protection of freedom of speech, or from the point of view of developing any kind of editorial independence. If the MPs or the members of the cabinet will be deciding whether they like the story or not, and that would be reflected on the editorial positions of those who make decisions in the newscast, that would be catastrophic. And what we're discussing is exactly how we fine-tune the model that allows us not to have this situation, that allows us to have a body that would, similarly to how the external design of the automobile allows us to be safe in case we have an accident, would actually be protecting the integrity of the public service broadcast from political risks, commercial risks, or any other risks. So in that sense, I think it's important that we make sure that the members of every board, and I'm making here distinct difference between managerial board inside the PSB and supervisory board that does oversight of the PSB, that both boards are professional. Both boards consist of people who are very prepared for the roles that is designated for them. Responding to Yves Solomon's remarks, I would like to say that I see more risks in not having well-motivated or professional people in the supervisory board than the risks that paying them would allow them to spend more time understanding what's going on in the PSB. I don't think that there is a risk that these people will be paid to actually dwell into something. What I am afraid of is that a lot of members of the existing or future supervisory boards will be coming to the meetings unprepared, because they simply did not have the time to see through the proposed solutions, to listen to all the parties, to understand the specifics. And I think this is important. I was one of the members of the supervisory board who fought hard last year when there was an attempt to dismiss the head of the PSB. And I was one of those people who actually filed a lawsuit to make sure that we have a legal action on behalf of the judiciary to stop this. And I, as much as I did not like this process, and as much as I think this was a absolutely unnecessary detour from the standpoint of the development of the public service broadcast, it also gave a lot of institutional experience that will stay with them. And in that sense, one of the things that I would really call to understand when we are bringing the European experience into Ukraine is that we are talking about very different institutional systems. Ukrainian legal system is a system that comes from a tradition of totalitarian oppression of society, and we have to understand.
Thank you.
And the other,
Mr. Hribovitsky.
and the last thing is, I would like to stress that public service broadcast, not a single year was financed in full. And this is also extremely important. If it's not going to be financed, we're not going to have the results.
Thank you very much. In their summing up remarks, the participants will have an opportunity to react to whatever they want to react from among what the other participants have said. But now I would like to switch to Q&As from the audience because there's a lot of questions. And I'll try to group them into certain sectors. Quite a lot of questions are about the regional aspect of the public broadcasting. And for instance, there's a question to Yves Salomon and Jan Peterson. How do our European colleagues see the fact that in the new model of regional broadcasting, there's stipulated an essential decrease of the volume of broadcasting made by the local public broadcaster. This threatens the right of citizens to receive local information of the necessary quality in the sufficient amount. That's one question about this. There's another question about basically the same, but it is not addressed specifically to our European colleagues. It's Mr. Pennings, in his introductory remarks, said that Sweden, maybe that's about Mr. Peterson anyway, Sweden supports regional broadcasting. This position is very valuable for us, journalists from the regions. My question is the following. What is the use for the Suspilne public broadcaster if Suspilne runs the policy of centralization instead of decentralization? And basically it says the same that the first question said. So the question is basically addressed to everyone, but I would like Yves Salomon and then Mr. Peterson to start because the very first question was to them personally.
Okay. Well, from my knowledge of the broadcasting landscape in Ukraine, and also the very limited funds available for public service broadcasting in Ukraine, I actually am very much in favor of centralization. And I see the regional broadcasters in the oblasts as replicating an awful lot of functions all around the country that could be much more cheaply done if they were centralized. I also think that the broadcasters in the oblasts are at risk of cementing local power bases, local political power bases, and threatening the independence of public service broadcasting. There are plenty of models all around the world where there's a single public service broadcaster but with regional offices and regional journalists, but they all feed into the center, and there are separate, local times, the times for local broadcasting, particularly around news. So it's not an either or. It's not you either have local broadcasting or you have a national broadcaster. You can have a national broadcaster with lots of local input, but there would be an enormous saving of money, and I think it would be easier to retain the independence of public service broadcasting if it were all centralized.
Thank you
As
very
well
much.
as
Now,
maintaining quality. That's another thing, maintaining quality.
okay, now let's hear about the Swedish model, which is probably one of the models.
Yes, of course. Well, the situation in Sweden is completely different compared to Ukraine, but we have a long tradition of very much of local production. So we have 25 local radio stations, for instance, and we have quite a lot of TV production outside Stockholm. And it is two parts. One part is the local coverage, and we broadcast local radio channels, for instance, at least 12 hours per day with local information, local programming. And that's one thing. And we also produce national program in the regions. That means that we are produce programs that are broadcast over the whole nation, but is produced outside the capital. And of course, it's a question of money, how to make this working, and so on. But I think from a journalistic point of view, it's very important to be close to the audience. And if you have money and you have possibilities to really work with the regional programming and local programming with people living close to people to produce this, I think it's a very good way of producing public service broadcasting, radio programs, TV programs, and so on, and to really get close to people. Of course, there could be lots of other problems that I don't recognize here, but I think in principle, the local programming is really the backbone of public service broadcasting.
Thank you, Mr. Hlibovitsky. What would you say to the claims that the policy of Suspilne deprives local communities of their right to receive quality local information?
I have two responses to that. First response is a obvious mismatch that we have in approach towards what is local. We are now entering the final stage of the decentralization reform, and we end up with amalgamated communities and the urban communities. And these communities do not have their community public broadcasters. What we have is we don't have local radio stations or local television stations, but we have regional television stations and regional radio stations. The question is, can we afford to go local? And the response at this point is no, we can't. And actually, the amount of decentralization decisions that have been done by the management of the public service broadcast in Ukraine was caused basically by two factors. First is the quality of governance. Part of the reason why some of the functions were centralized was to ensure the quality of governance, and that this was the case when the reform was going top down. The new team came in. They wanted to make sure that they can make the appropriate decisions. They saw that there was a problem, in some case even resistance from the on the grassroots level, and some of the resistance was caused by the fact that those who worked in local branches, and I remind you that we're talking about the reform that takes us from the state TV and radio into public TV and radio, and some of these people did not share the mission of the public service broadcast. They actually were the ones who were in incredible comfort zone because they were paid by politicians and they were simply servicing them on air. And of course they lost. Of course they were not happy. On the other hand, if public service broadcast will keep on being underfinanced, there is no way it will be able to invest into local, into local programming and local development of the local branches as much as it should. In that sense, I think
to catch up on this point, there's another question which I
Can I,
also
can I
addressed to.
well,
Yes, you will have the opportunity to say, but because Mr. Glebovitsky mentioned this, there's a question: are there any guarantee at all that financial independence and stable financing of public broadcaster will ever happen? So
Well, there are no
briefly to this, Mr. Glebovitsky, and then we go to Ms.
Well,
Kravchuk.
there are no guarantees in this world, as we know. You know, we were all having our own plans for this spring and summer, and they were quite different from the way it turned out. But what we do have is probabilities, and we have to work to make sure that these probabilities can be extended or can be lowered. You know, I think that. What is happening right now is that in many regions locally in Ukraine, in many regions, current public service broadcast, even though it is not up to the quality that I personally would like, it is still the freest broadcaster on the local market. In many cases, locally, there is no other place where you can have a coherent discussion. And I think this is already a huge step forward. Now our goal is to make it sustainable and to expand to build on that.
All right, the goal is there, but there is no guarantee. Maybe Ms. Kravchuk will provide us with the definite answer to this.
if I would be the Minister of Finance, I would say yes.
Well, as Mr. Glebovitsky said, our plans may change.
Yes, that's true, and that's actually, what's happened during the COVID. It actually interfered different spheres. Actually, I'm a member of PSC as a representative in the assembly, and I didn't go to Strasbourg. We'll miss 2 sessions. You know, the global politics changed. Everything changes. But as I said, we will do everything what is, from our side as the members of parliament to fight for the proper financing. About the independence and local broadcasters. You see, I've been working in journalism, in PR and political PR more than I've been a member of parliament, like 10 times more. Because member of parliament less than a year, and before that I actually started working at the national television company that was before the public broadcasting. That was my first job, and I can support Yevhen that at local level it's very, very difficult to have an independent TV from the local politicians, because it's even harder. They've been working with private TV. They own private TV. They've been working with previous auditorka, how they called before, and then it changed. So it's important to understand that. From Kiev and the supervisory board and deputies will of course try to support the local broadcaster, but I also think that we cannot financially support 25 different or 24 different companies, and it's of course we need to have local news, local TV shows, local moving TV shows. But I agree with Eve that some of the programs can be cheaper made, by centralization.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the finale of our discussion, so I usurp the right and opportunities of the moderator to ask a question of myself, and this is the correlation between public broadcaster and community broadcasters. The third sector in Ukraine, the third sector of broadcasting. I think that we do not pay enough attention to this. Maybe Jan Pettersson will start to share briefly Swedish experience in this case.
Well, we do not have so much contact with community broadcasters actually. We are working in our field of public service broadcasting and also have quite a lot of contacts with commercial radio and TV and so on. So we don't have so much experience of community broadcasting with regards from the Swedish public service broadcasting system, so to speak. So this interaction is not something that we are familiar with.
Well, obviously you have your reasons for this. Mr. Hlibovitsky.
I think the communities are only to come. And I think it's important that we make sure that we can ensure sustainability of what we have right now in Ukraine. And I think it's important that we secure the mission of the public, sustainability of the mission of the public service broadcast, regardless of who runs it. We'll have to go through this transition within a year, which will be very important. And I think it will be very difficult, and for those of you who are in the who understand how different the communities are, or how difficult it is to actually talk about communities on the very grassroots level, and how uneven, how different Ukraine is in that sense, how diverse it is. I think we can't have efficient community public service before actually communities consist of responsible citizens who understand the value of freedoms on the local level. I am afraid in many cases what will happen on a local level in Ukraine with decentralization reform is that a single big employer or a single big local politician will seize control of many assets, will basically seize control over the local democratic process. And it will take some time before we actually sort it out. So I think we first should focus on making sure that the existing PSB, the way it is structured, is sustainable and it's successful. And then 5 to 10 years from now, we will be able to talk about more local level than we are talking about at the moment.
Understood, Mr. Hlibovitsky, and I would endorse your words if we were talking about communities as only a geographical notion, but communities are not only geographical. Let's listen to what Eugenia Kravchuk says on this score.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, because I was...
The question is how public broadcasters should cooperate, if at all, with community broadcasters, and don't you feel that we do not pay enough attention to the third sector in broadcasting in Ukraine?
Well, actually, we're also in the middle of huge work on the media law. And actually, one big part of the media law is about broadcasters of the community broadcasters. And actually, yes, we have not only geographical communities, but we have also the broadcasting of communities that are united, on different, religion, whatever. And actually, we will be. We received from Council of Europe a lot of expertise, and we will imply this. We will put into the law. Actually, next week we plan to have the first reading on the media law as well. So it's going to be a big media week, and actually we will put on additional first reading to actually put all the amendments that we received from different advisors and from Council of Europe as well. But really, we need to understand that it's a very long process on changing the landscape of broadcasting and having it independent, because it's been like this for years and years and years. And actually, we have we'll have local elections in October. We hope that we'll have local elections, and the Corona crisis will not return, and we'll actually be able to elect. And it's probably going to be the first local elections when we'll have all the communities, because we're right now finishing the reform that has started 5 years ago. So probably after the October, we'll need to look at this landscape and see, maybe some communities will, would like to have their own broadcasters as well.
And some of them are already having it. Thank you very much, Eve Solomon.
Cities.
Well, the model of community broadcasting that is applied around the world is a model which is independent public service of the public service broadcaster, as well as being independent of commercial interests and independent of political interests. So we're talking about radio and television stations that are really run by volunteers, run by enthusiasts who are part of their community for their community. And that is done really quite apart from the public service broadcaster. I think I haven't seen the latest draft of the media law, but I know in earlier drafts of the media law, there was a lot of difficulty, I think, in terms of trying to keep local media, community media, absolutely independent of political interests. Because I think the real risk in Ukraine is that you have community media, which is actually just run by local politicians. And that I would urge has to be avoided at all costs.
Thank you very much. We are almost done, and I can accord half a minute to each of the participants to make very brief summing up remarks. Who volunteers to make the summing up remarks? Mr. Lybovitsky.
Okay, that's I'm used to that. Not volunteering, but being called upon. I think we've gone as far as no one in the former Soviet Union, except for the Baltic states, has gone, and I think we shouldn't take that for granted. I think we need a lot of very precise attention to why we have succeeded and why we have not succeeded in many things that we have. I think it's very important that we maintain as open and as inclusive of a discussion with everyone involved in the political sector, in the expert sector, in the civil society, and including even businesses in Ukraine. When I'm talking about minorities and PSB, I'm saying that the biggest minority in Ukraine is probably the middle class. Entrepreneurs are another minority, and to this day, their legislation is rather punitive than supportive. So in that sense, towards entrepreneurs. So in that sense, I would say that we have to take very careful approaches and proceed with caution. We already have something that we can lose, and I don't want to see us losing it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone wants to join in? Or just as there are dozens of questions, some of them may be grouped into groups like I did. Some of them are very individual questions. In the questionnaire that was put to those who joined our discussion as viewers and listeners on YouTube, on the Facebook, one of the participants naming the goal of her participation in this webinar said, just to listen. Just to listen. I think that after listening comes thinking, and after thinking comes action. That's what the people who took part are very good at, and I think that we all have learned from each other in the course of this seminar. Thank you, dear participants. Thank you, dear viewers. Thank you, dear organizers. And I think that another discussion will follow soon. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.